Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to the second discussion video in my Victorian-style serialised read-along for Charles Dickens's Bleak House. Actually, also, before I begin, some of you may have noticed that I've been absent from BookTube in the last few weeks. I haven't put up a video for a couple of weeks. This is just for kind of personal and family reasons. I decided to take a few weeks off BookTube while dealing with stuff going on in my family, but I am back now and there will be 2 videos up a week as usual, starting from this week. If you don't know what this is, I'll link the Goodreads group down below, but basically I'm currently hosting a Victorian-style serialised read-along where I'm reading Charles Dickens's Bleak House in the original serialised parts over a year and a half. Today is my discussion video for the chapters which we read in the month of April. So in the month of April we read Chapter 5, A Morning Adventure, Chapter 6, Quite at Home, and Chapter 7, The Ghost's Walk. So I'm going to be talking through those chapters today, first giving a quick sort of synopsis of them and then talking about points of interest in these chapters. In Chapter 5, A Morning Adventure, Esther awakens in Mrs. Jellyby's house where we left her last time. She tries again to help sort of put the house in order, to look after some of the children that are not especially well looked after by Mrs. Jellyby, and then her caddy Ada and Richard all venture out on a walk. And on this walk they run into Miss Flight, a slightly eccentric elderly lady that they met before. Miss Flight says that she would be honoured if they would visit her lodgings, and she takes them back to the place that she lives, above a shop owned by a man called Mr. Crook, who Miss Flight says is slightly or she is slightly ashamed of Mr. Crook, her landlord. Still, she takes the young people up to her room and shows them how she lives and also all of the many birds that she keeps locked up, and she will set free the day that she receives her judgment from the Court of Chancery. And then they head on back to Mrs. Jellyby's house, where Esther, Richard and Ada depart to go on to their new home, Bleak House, and meet Mr. Jarndyce. So, points of interest in this chapter. Again, I want to touch a little bit on the character of Mrs. Jellyby and the presentation of the chaos of the house. It's interesting, I think, to compare the sort of chaos and mistiness and dirt of Mrs. Jellyby's house with the disorder of the Court of Chancery. There are so many images of kind of disorder in this book. Esther says the windows were so encrusted with dirt that they would have made midsummer sunshine dim, which is quite similar to the image of fog and dirt which we got in Chapter 1 in the Court of Chancery. Esther says that crumbs, dust and waste paper were all over the house, and on their way out they meet the servant coming out of the public house. This image that we got at the end of the last part of kind of disorder and chaos and dirt in this house is really emphasised, and it's interesting as well to act as a comparison point to Bleak House when we meet it in the next chapter. Again, Dickens strongly criticises the way Mrs. Jellyby runs her household and the way that she disregards her daughter, and when Esther suggests that Caddy might speak a little too strongly out against her mother, Caddy says, "Oh, don't talk of duty as a child, Miss Summerson. Where's Ma's duty as a parent?" Duty is a really interesting theme in this book, and it will come up again and again, and I'll mention it several times, but it's something Esther feels very strongly about. Esther often talks about having a sense of duty to do things. Esther has this strong sense instilled from her childhood that she is not really worthwhile, and that therefore, being a kind of worthless person, she must strive so hard to do her duty, to work hard, to be useful and to be dutiful, and this is something that Esther feels very strongly about, and Dickens strongly praises her for it. So the idea that Caddy might be partially disregarding her duty as a child, but also that Mrs. Jellyby is utterly failing in her duty as a parent is very, very important. I spoke last time more in depth about the way Mrs. Jellyby is criticised for working and therefore neglecting her household, and I'll talk about this a little bit more as the book goes on, and also I'll talk about it a little bit in relation to Skimpole as well, but we shall go on to talk about that. I want to talk a bit about Miss Flight and also about omens. Bleak House is a book that uses lots of images of omens and foreshadowing, and sometimes it's actual foreshadowing and sometimes it's Dickens just kind of using the image of foreshadowing to create kind of an atmosphere of suspense and tension. Miss Flight says that it is a good omen for her to have youth and beauty come into her home. She is someone that places a great emphasis on symbols and kind of symbolism in her life. Things for her take on a very kind of spiritual significance. Things can be omens, and also she keeps these birds locked up as a kind of metaphor for the fact that she herself is locked up awaiting her judgment from Chancery, and she says she will let them go on the day that her case is solved. She even says, "I can't allow them to sing much," perhaps suggesting that she herself has constricted the pleasure of her life. She's lived by Chancery all the time. Her kind of misery and her lifelong readalong chasing after this chancery suit that has never been resolved presents a kind of dismal image of what could potentially happen to Ada and Richard. I want to talk as well a bit about Mr. Crook and the weird shop that he owns. His shop is very, very strange and so thoroughly Dickensian in its kind of Victorian rag and bone bottle crazy assortment of weird things. Mr. Crook is eccentric and certainly not respectable, and yet there is an interesting parallel that Dickens draws between the Court of Chancery and its vague, complicated, misty mess of so many different things that no one quite knows what's going on, in comparison with Crook's shop. Mr. Crook is jokingly called by the locals the Lord Chancellor, although the actual Lord Chancellor, however respectable he may seem, is in fact no better than this strange man, Mr. Crook. You see, I have so many things here, of so many kinds and all, as the neighbours think, but they know nothing, wasting away and going to rack and ruin. That's why they have given me and my place a christening. While Mr. Crook is there to make a kind of mockery of the Court of Chancery, his cat, Lady Jane, i.e. named after Lady Jane Grey, is there to serve as a kind of mockery of royalty. Earlier I spoke about omens, but another bad omen aside from Miss Flight herself is the story that Mr. Crook tells about Tom Jarndyce, who shot himself just across the road from Mr. Crook's shop. Ada and Richard are visibly very affected by this, as they would be, and it gives them an insight perhaps into the case that they are in and the misery it has caused for so many people. I think that's all I have to say about the first chapter of these three for this month, and I'll go on to talking about chapter 6, Quite at Home. Chapter 6 makes me very happy because it is where we encounter Mr. Jarndyce for the first time, or actually not for the first time, for the second time, but for the first time in which he is named, and I love Mr. Jarndyce. I think he's one of Dickens's best creations for being so wonderfully eccentric, but also for me so believable as well. In the chapter Quite at Home, Esther, Ada and Richard travel on to Bleak House. They arrive there and are first greeted by a note from Mr. Jarndyce saying he wishes to greet them as old friends and not have any introductions or any thanks. They turn up and he does indeed greet them as old friends and take them into his house, show them around the house, and later at dinner introduce them to his friend Harold Skimpole, who I will have a lot to say about. Mr. Skimpole says that he is quite a child and understands nothing of the world and nothing of money, which makes it not terribly surprising when later on that evening he is arrested for debt and persuades Esther and Richard to spend their savings on bailing him out of debtor's prison. Esther is given the housekeeping keys and feels this new responsibility very, very much and is moved by it and pleased with it and excited to begin her new life. So, let's talk about points of interest in Quite at Home because it's quite a long chapter and there are a lot of interesting things to discuss. Firstly, I want to talk about the imagery of the countryside versus the city, and especially of the kind of Court of Chancery in comparison to the world of Bleak House. The very imagery of the weather. The day had brightened very much and still brightened as we went westward. By and by we began to leave the wonderful city and to proceed through suburbs which of themselves would have made a pretty large town in my eyes, and at large we got into a real country road again, with windmills, rickyards, milestones, farmers' wagons, scents of old hay, swinging signs and horse troughs, trees, fields and hedgerows. It was delightful to see the green landscape before us and the immense metropolis behind. The darkness of Chancery is really left behind as we move into the countryside, and the countryside in Bleak House is presented as being much more picturesque, much less dirty, much less muddy than the city, and also much clearer. They can see the day brightens and everything really brightens. Similarly, Bleak House is not bleak at all, although it is, like its owner, delightfully irregular. Full of odd passages and rooms leading into other rooms, full of old-fashioned furniture and everything that is, in Esther's words, pleasantly irregular. I love the description of the house. It's a long, long passage, but it's really, really beautiful. And I'm just going to read you the ending of it because I think it tells a lot, not only about the house and the welcoming environment Mr. Jarndyce presents to them, but also about the way Esther feels for this, which in a way is her first real home. She grew up with her godmother in such a horrible environment where she never really felt at ease, and then she was at school, which is obviously slightly different. And for this, coming to this place for her, it's her first real experience of what will be a home. Such, with its illuminated windows, softened here and there by shadows of curtains, shining out upon the starlit night, with its light and warmth and comfort, with its hospitable jingle at a distance of preparations for dinner, with the face of its generous master brightening everything we saw, and just wind enough without to sound a low accompaniment to everything we heard, were our first impressions of Bleak House. Of course, I also want to speak about Mr. Jarndyce. Mr. Jarndyce is, I think, one of my favourite characters in Dickens. I love the fact that he sends this letter welcoming the young people, but also saying that he wants to greet them as old friends to effectively save on awkwardness. And I love the story that Ada tells them about him running away out of fear of gratitude. Ada dimly remembered to have heard her mother tell when she was a very little child that he had once done her an uncommon act of generosity, and that on her going to his house to thank him, he happened to see her through a window coming to the door and immediately escaped by the back gate and was not heard of for 3 months. You definitely get a sense of Mr. Jarndyce as this man who hates confrontation, hates awkwardness, hates unpleasantness, and later told that he sleeps with the window open, harking back to that earlier story and making you think that perhaps he sleeps with the window open so that he can climb out of the window and escape any unpleasantness that might occur. Rather than addressing head-on any conflict or any awkwardness or any unpleasantness, he always says, "The wind is in the east." That is his metaphor for all unpleasant situations. The wind is in the east, and that is kind of as much as he is willing to address them. And he also strives to see the best in people. Introduced to Skimpole, who Mr. Jarndyce loves very dearly and is willing to take at face value of being a child rather than someone who just kind of, avoids all his responsibilities in life by pretending that he is a child. I'll talk a lot about Skimpole as the book goes on. I find him quite an interesting character, especially to compare to Mrs. Jellyby, because him and Mrs. Jellyby in some ways are quite similar. Both of them entirely neglect their families and their family responsibilities for other concerns. Mrs. Jellyby for work and Harold Skimpole for idleness. He is sort of criticised for it in this chapter, but because he's so charming and everyone also kind of likes him, he's not as strongly criticised, although we'll talk about him more as the book goes on. But it's interesting to compare him and Mrs. Jellyby, I think, because they behave towards their families in similar ways of neglect, I suppose, through very different means. And I think it's very interesting in terms of looking at Bleak House's depiction of gender and kind of Victorian ideas of gender. But Mrs. Jellyby's sin that she works so hard that she neglects her family, whereas Skimpole's is the opposite, that he doesn't work and that is his failure to his family. Esther says to Mr. Jarndyce about Mrs. Jellyby, "It is right to begin with the obligations of home, sir, and perhaps, while those are overlooked and neglected, no other duties can possibly be substituted for them." And this is a gendered statement, I think, because they don't seem to quite think that about Harold Skimpole, even though we're told that he has like a dozen children who he has never worked to support and who he kind of ignores and just lets his friends pay all his debts because he is a child. He says that he has no idea of money and doesn't understand business, and so therefore seems quite happy to allow Esther and Richard, these young people, to pay his debt. Mr. Jarndyce says at the end of the chapter that no one but Skimpole would have thought it, being a child, but whether you choose to believe that Skimpole really is childish and doesn't understand the magnitude of what he's asking them to do, or whether he just doesn't care, is a matter for further discussion. And Mr. Jarndyce says he relies upon everybody and says you can't make him responsible. The idea of Harold Skimpole with designs or plans or knowledge or consequences, ha ha ha. So I think it's interesting that at this stage in the book, Mrs. Jellyby's neglect of her family is presented as being a place for severe social criticism, whereas Harold Skimpole's neglect of his children and wife is presented as being comical at this stage in the book. And again, we'll talk about Skimpole much later as the book goes on. I also want to talk a little bit about Esther in this chapter. I love the moment where Ada says to Mr. Jarndyce that it didn't rain sweets in the Jellyby household, but that it rained Esther, and that was even better. Because I think it's such a sweet way of describing Esther's way with children and also her kindness and the fact that everybody immediately warms themselves to her. But despite the fact that she is like universally liked by everyone she meets, she's still very insecure and still desperate to be useful. She is honoured when she receives the housekeeping keys, even though having been employed as a companion, it might be slightly weird to then find yourself in the position of housekeeper at the age of 20. I don't know, but she is really honoured by receiving the keys because she is quite lost in the magnitude of my trust, and the idea that Mr. Jarndyce completely trusts her is astounding to her. She willingly parts with like her life savings to help out Mr. Skimpole, a man that she met just that evening, because she wishes to be useful. Later she tells us that she's learning to play backgammon from Mr. Jarndyce, from whom I wished of course to learn it as quickly as I could in order that I might be of the very small use of being able to play when he had no better adversary. She wishes desperately to be of use at all times, even like just to play cards with Mr. Jarndyce. She's always thinking, how can I be useful to other people? How can I help other people? At the end of the chapter, she thinks about her new life and says to herself, Esther, 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 duty, my dear, and that gives her hope. The idea that she has duties and responsibilities and that she is in some way useful to the people around her is for her incredibly important to her own self-worth. I think that's all I wanted to say about that chapter, and now to talk about chapter 7, The Ghost's Walk. In this chapter we are in Lincolnshire at Chesney Wold, the house of the Deadlocks, though the Deadlocks are not there. We're once more in the third person present tense, with a real change of tone, and we encounter the housekeeper of Chesney Wold, Mrs. Rouncewell, and also her grandson Wat, and one of the servants she's training up, Rosa, who Wat is rather taken with. Interrupting the dismal weather of Chesney Wold appear Mr. Guppy, who we met before, and a friend of his, who are out on business as lawyers and have asked to come and have a look at Chesney Wold. They walk around the house, and two things of importance occur. One is that Mr. Guppy sees a painting of Lady Dedlock that is incredibly familiar to him, and he can't shake the idea that he has seen this face before, perhaps in a dream. And the second thing is that they get to a place in the house called the Ghost Walk, and Rosa and Mrs. Rouncewell tell the story of why it's called the Ghost Walk, this dramatic event that occurred several years in the past, and this idea that whenever you hear steps on the Ghost Walk, whether it be actually rain or whether it be something supernatural, it is suggesting that tragedy and perhaps disgrace, though not disgrace as Mrs. Rouncewell, for disgrace never comes to this family, it is suggesting that some tragedy and bad things are coming to the family of the Dedlocks. So again, like we spoke about earlier with Miss Flight and all the omens, in this chapter we have a lot of bad omens for things to come for the Dedlocks. So, points of interest in this chapter. I love the change in tone between Esther's chapters and the third person present tense chapters. Partly, like, one of the reasons why I love Bleak House so much is that dual narrative and how well it works together and how interesting it is, especially I think because Esther's narrative is so like warm and she loves everybody, whereas the third person narrative is much colder and starker and bleaker, and that kind of makes me really happy in a weird way. While Esther sleeps and while Esther wakes, it is still wet weather down at the place in Lincolnshire. The rain is ever falling, drip, 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 by night and day upon the broad flagged terrace pavement, the Ghost Walk. The weather is so very bad down in Lincolnshire that the liveliest imagination can scarcely apprehend its ever being fine again. The place is dingy and dark and wet, and seems almost to represent the personality of Lady Dedlock as we encountered it before, who is bored and dismal and indifferent and kind of grey in a way. We learn about Mrs. Rouncewell, the housekeeper, her grandson and her two sons, one of whom ran wild and became a soldier, and the other of whom works in industry further in the north, and we also learn that she has been at Chesney Wold a long time. In fact, she has been there 50 years, 3 months and a fortnight, by the blessing of heaven if I live till Tuesday. And I think the fact that she knows precisely how long she's been there tells us quite a lot about her attachment to the house and the family. I think it's interesting as well to dwell on the way that Dickens describes the relationship between Sir Leicester and Miss Rouncewell. The present representative of the Dedlocks is an excellent master. He supposes all his dependents to be utterly bereft of individual characters, intentions or opinions, and is persuaded that he was born to supersede the necessity of their having any. But he is an excellent master still, holding it a part of his state to be so. He has a great liking for Mrs. Rouncewell. He says she is a most respectable, creditable woman. Dickens even says that he feels that his dignity is safer with her than with anybody else. So we get such an interesting sense of Sir Leicester Dedlock as being so very, very upper class and so dismissive of the lower orders, but also having such respect for Mrs. Rouncewell and liking her so much at the same time. He considers people of a lower class to him as being incredibly different to him, but he doesn't look down upon them exactly, he just views them as being set apart. There's so much I want to talk about in this chapter that I can't talk about without spoiling later stuff, because Dickens is good at kind of laying seeds of things. It's something quite interesting because I saw the television adaptation of Bleak House before I read the book. It's hard to tell what bits of the plot I would have guessed if I'd read the book first, and also I think the bits of the plot you might piece together reading Bleak House over the course of a month. There are more of them than reading it over the course of 18 months, where you would of course forget things previously, especially little throwaway mentions of things that you might have forgotten by the time you get to later chapters. That's a side note, but anyway, let's talk about the Ghost's Walk. Dickens is someone who loves to write about ghosts, and he actually wrote in a preface to Bleak House that in this book he had purposely dwelt upon the romantic side of familiar things. Dealing with reality, he's talking about real life, but he's also dropping in a few little fantastical things here and there, and you can read the ghost as a metaphor. You can think that the sounds they hear are just rain, or you can read it as Dickens kind of suggesting minor supernatural things going on there, because he does enjoy a bit of the supernatural in his books. Whether you believe there is a real ghost at Chesney Wold or whether it is just the ghosts of secrets and the past, everyone there that day does say that they can hear it. Mrs. Rouncewell says that even Lady Dedlock, who is afraid of nothing, admits that when it is there, it must be heard. You cannot shut it out. This idea of the tapping on the Ghost's Walk, this suggestion that bound up with the past, this tapping suggests that sadness and calamity and perhaps disgrace is coming to the Deadlock house. Obviously sets us up for an interesting and curious novel. So I think that's actually all I have to say about those 3 chapters that we read during the month of April. Hopefully this video will be slightly less long than the last one. So in the month of May, we'll be reading the next 3 chapters in Bleak House. Chapter 8, Covering a Multitude of Sins. Chapter 9, Signs and Tokens. And Chapter 10, The Law Writer. I'm just so excited. I'm really enjoying rereading Bleak House. It's been so many years since I read it last, and I do love it dearly. And it is a masterpiece. I love Our Mutual Friend more, but I think Bleak House is possibly Charles Dickens's most technically accomplished novel, if you know what I mean. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments how you enjoyed this month's chapters of Bleak House, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.